benefits and the drawbacks of joining a free trade area or customs union, and I've given you a whole list here, but I've also done another video which I think you should refer to, because that will go through the mind map of all the benefits and all the drawbacks as well. But the key one that you've got to talk about as a benefit is the fact that there is a free trade area here where you are having trade creation. Okay, now let's look at this. The trade creation diagram is important. You've got to be able to use this in the exam. So what we're looking at here, and it's really important that you spot this, this is a UK market. So this is the UK market for cheese, and the French produce really good cheese, and it has lower cost than the UK, and we don't want so much cheese from them, and so we in the UK had put a tariff before we joined the customs bloc, the European Union in this case. We placed a tariff so that our imports were only that distance there. Now we join the customs union or the free trade area, we have to remove that tariff, and so the French price here without the tariff is much lower, and so the price in our market now is going to be PEU, and so therefore there's going to be an extension here of consumer demand. So demand goes up to this, and the UK firms can now only produce at Q3, because remember, with this tariff, this was the cost of producing in the UK. We were below the French price all there, so we were producing that output. Now we remove that tariff, UK firms will only produce that amount. So UK output, UK consumption, therefore the difference between them is the new imports from France. So this is the idea of trade being created here. So trade has been created because there's been an increase in demand from UK consumers for that lovely French cheese, and the UK firms are not producing it, and the French firms are producing it and selling it into the UK. So these two quantities here are known as trade creation. Trade has been created. Now it's an import, an increase in imports, obviously, in the UK, but any imports that are coming into the UK from the trading bloc are the exports of the the French cheese industry. So exports have risen within the trading bloc. That's the key. In addition to that, this is the cheese market where the UK is not very efficient, hasn't got a comparative advantage, but let's say we have a comparative advantage in financial services. In the financial services market, the same would happen, but it would be the UK that is then exporting more financial services into the European Union. So our exports of the UK, other goods, when the tariff is moved, also goes up. And you've really got to use both those points in any analysis. So there's more exports from the lower cost, those countries with a comparative advantage, and there's not only the French coming into our country, but we are exporting more into the European Union as well. And that's the idea behind trade creation. So that's a benefit, because if you have trade is the engine of growth, and it leads to all sorts of positive benefits. Now, let's look at it in terms of the three sections of the economy, or the three economic agents. So we start off with the consumer. Now, you'll see, hopefully, when the price has gone down, this used to be our consumer surplus, now it's here, and so therefore there is a gain in consumer surplus, which is this area here. As soon as you say that, you can say that there's lower prices now from goods, leading to an increase in real income after inflation, remember, so prices have come down. I have now an increase in my living standards, because if I was a great cheese and wine buff and I bought them from France, the price is lower, I've now got more money in my pocket to go and buy other goods and services. You could also question, well, what goods and services? If it's food and basic goods, then that's fine. A lot of consumers in the UK would benefit. But if it's luxury items, then only the higher socioeconomic groups might benefit. But another good thing to talk about is, well, what if it's imports of machinery? So therefore, lower prices of machinery, that's capital investment, therefore you'd get some investment going on as well. So lots to talk about in terms of the consumer. But obviously, as we've always said before, whenever you get this gain here in your consumer surplus, there's also a loss of producer surplus. So these are before we joined the bloc, the UK was producing here. Now the UK firms are producing here. So there's a loss of output for the domestic producer, loss of surplus, loss of investment, loss of jobs, etc. Okay, and the other loss is the loss of tariff revenue. So this was the tariff that we got on those imports, those old imports. Now the government, because there's no tariffs, actually lose that tariff revenue. So even though there's a welfare gain here, the consumer surplus gain, that's offset by a producer surplus and a tariff revenue, but you still have two triangles here, which we call the welfare gains that we get from joining a free trade area. So that's your basic diagram that you need to explain, but it does go on to look in a minute at something that's called trade diversion, and you need to know the idea behind trade diversion, although for the Edexcel exam board you do not need to know the diagram, but you need to know the basics. So I'm just going to give you a simple example, and then I will show you a diagram if you want to use it. So this is the idea, as I say, the diagrammatic approach, that the UK, and it's important in a minute when we do the diversion that we're going to talk about what those two triangles really mean. So triangle A means that we are, as I say, the UK firms are no longer producing here, they're producing here. So this is a, as I say, a welfare gain triangle, and what it is, because it's a consumer gain, there's the consumer surplus, that was gained, loss of producer, loss of tariff, that's a gain triangle, and it means that the UK higher cost, because this was the cost, supply curve always reflects your marginal cost of production, the UK were able to supply at this higher cost than France, and now the UK higher cost firms are no longer producing the cheese. So that's where you get that gain from. Then here, this is the fact that there has been an increase, oops, let me go back, there has been an increase in the consumers here who are now willing and able to buy this cheese, and before that was their marginal benefit, but they weren't actually able to buy it because the consumption was up here, because the price was up here. So this demand wasn't actually there, but it should have been there because the marginal benefit up on your demand curve exceeds the marginal cost, which is the French marginal cost. So again, both those triangles you need to be able to explain in terms of the gain in welfare. But as I've just hinted at, we now also need to look at the fact that there's trade diversion. And trade diversion is simply saying that instead of, as I say, producing in the lowest cost country, we are now diverting our output from a low-cost country to a high-cost country. Now, what you have to then do is bring in a third country into the equation. This is in this case, it's going to be the USA. So this is we're going to look at an example of buying trucks. So I've just made up the example, so don't worry about it being accurate. It just gives you a good idea about what trade diversion is. So if you want to buy your trucks, you can buy it from UK, France, or the USA. So let's say in the UK they cost £20,000, but in France they cost £17,000 to make a truck, and in the USA they cost 15. So the USA has a comparative advantage in truck making. We use the pound just because we don't want to confuse this with exchange rates or anything like that. So before we go into the EU, the UK would obviously buy from the lowest cost producer, the USA. But if we had to then join the EU with France, so the USA is not in the EU, France is, we would have to, as a UK, we would have to impose this common external tariff of, let's say, 20%, or that would be £3,000 on the cost of those trucks. So the cost of a truck coming in from the US now is £18,000. So it's gone above the French price, and so therefore we would be buying from France at £17,000, not because we're not buying the £18,000 USA truck, but now we're not buying from the USA, which is the lowest cost producer, and it's because we have to put the common external tariff on. So that is the basics of what we mean by trade diversion. If you want to see it in a diagram form, I will show you the diagram. Okay. This is the idea that this is the price in the US, this is the price in the EU. Without joining a customs union here or free trade area, we were buying our trucks from the USA at this low price here. Then, because we join the customs union, we have to put a common external tariff on the US trucks, and so the USA price plus the tariff is now higher than the European price, so therefore we will import our goods from the from the EU. Here, we were buying them from the USA, we're now buying them from the EU. Okay, what's the effect on the market of that? Well, because the price has gone up, there is a loss of consumer surplus, okay, by that area there. So it was this whole triangle, now it's this triangle. So we've lost consumer surplus, but there has been a gain in producer surplus. So we need to look here at loss and bring in inefficiency if we can. So we've gained producer surplus because the UK producers were only producing that much, now they're producing up here. This bit here, this box in the middle though, is an efficiency loss. Now, the loss in consumer surplus is this whole area. There's no tariff, remember, on EU imports, so this isn't a tariff box, and so therefore the loss in surplus is that whole area there, DCBA. But this bit here is a loss of efficiency because in the market we are now importing from the EU, whereas before we could have been importing from the USA without this tariff on. So we are importing from the highest cost country and not the USA, the lowest cost country. So this is an inefficiency in terms of what we're doing. We're importing, as I say, this amount, but not at the low cost, but it's coming from the high cost, less efficient French. There's also a triangle here, okay, which is this loss in consumer surplus. It's saying we are buying this amount here now from the UK truck manufacturers, and and those are higher cost. In other words, the marginal cost in UK, remember, is on the supply curve. That's where you measure your marginal cost. We are buying it from this truck manufacturer in the UK when we could have been buying it from the USA. So that triangle there is also some sort of inefficiency. And this triangle here is another inefficiency because we are now not buying these goods anymore. So the demand has gone down to C. This is the demand at this new EU price. It was here with the US price. We are now not buying that. And the question is, should we have been buying it? Well, you always go to the demand curve and you say that's the marginal benefit. So the marginal benefit of, say, that one there is up here. The marginal cost of producing it, if we'd been buying it from the US, is down there. So the argument is we should have been consuming this much and buying it because the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. So we've lost that area of efficiency. So that whole loss in consumer surplus here is basically, all right, a loss of efficiency as the imports are coming from the high cost EU. There's the loss of efficiency because the UK consumers are not buying it and they should have been buying it. Their marginal benefit exceeds their marginal cost. And finally, we are buying from the high cost UK firms and not the lower cost USA firms. So this whole area here, A, B, C, D, it's a loss of consumer surplus that hasn't been transferred to producers, and it's split into those three areas of inefficiency, if you like, as well. So trade diversion can be looked at in that way, and you can see the idea behind the welfare loss and trade diversion away from the low-cost producer to the high-cost producer. Okay, you can stop the video here, and you would do well to produce that in the exam. If you want to go deeper into this topic, I'm going to go deeper now. So let's have a look. This is a different scenario where what happened is we had the option, this is the UK market, to buy from the US or from the EU, and the UK had put a tariff on both of those countries. We'd put a tariff on the EU and a tariff on the US. So in this case, we were importing from the US here, and we got a tariff revenue from the US when we bought those amounts of imports. So what happens when we join a customs union? When we join a customs union, we only keep a tariff on the US, and we take the tariff off the EU. Remember, it was up here, now it's here. So now we are buying imports from the EU, not from the lowest cost producer. But there is now a consumer surplus gain, because we were, if you remember, buying it from the US at this price when we had the tariff on. The EU, I've left the P4, that was the EU tariff price. We were buying it at P3, we're now buying it at P2 because we can't put a tariff on the EU. So the price has gone down, which leads to a consumer surplus gain. All right. If that's gained, we need to say, but we have lost that tariff. But, so there's a loss also of producer surplus, which is given by this area. In other words, we were producing here when we were buying from the US. Now with the EU, the UK is producing here. So this is a loss of producer surplus. So here's your gain, here's your loss of producer surplus. You still have these welfare gain triangles. There's a gain triangle, there's a gain triangle. Remember, the consumer surplus is a gain because the price has come down. All right, but now you get a little bit more tricky, if that's not tricky enough, and you say, but hold on a minute, there's two areas which are lost tariff revenue, because we were getting this box here, if you remember, of tariff from the USA. Now we are losing that box of tariff. So we've lost producer surplus, area A. We've gained welfare gain triangles there, B and D, but we've lost this whole area here of tariff revenue. And this E, this box here is an important one, often gets missed out when students do this. But what this is then saying is that if this is a gain, but this is a loss, that box there is a loss, we end up with two gain triangles, B and D, but we've got two loss boxes, C and E. So therefore, what you have to argue is, if those two triangles there, B and D, which is the gain that you're getting, if that is smaller than that loss of E, then there will be an overall welfare loss in the economy. So that's tricky, but if you can and want to bring that into your analysis or evaluation, I think that would be, then you're going to be scoring really high marks. But so the key is that you find the tariff revenue that you've lost, and whereas in the previous examples it was, well, you know, we lost here and we lost here, and so we still end up with two gains. Now the loss of tariff revenue box is much higher, and so you have to question whether E is bigger than B and D put together, or is it smaller. So complicated, and as I say, you don't need all of that, but if you want the whole lot, that's the whole lot for you. Okay, hope you enjoyed.